private tax law firm. Now, Burke is charged with a total of 14 counts. That includes 1 count of racketeering, 2 counts of federal program bribery, 2 counts of attempted extortion, 1 count of conspiracy to commit extortion, and 8 counts of using interstate commerce to facilitate an unlawful activity.
All right, we have Sarah Schulte, who is standing by live at the courthouse, and Sarah has been in the courtroom since day 1 of this trial, covering this case for us day by day. Sarah, let's go through this right now. The jury was very quiet yesterday, and then this afternoon we get word that there is a verdict.
That's right. No questions, no notes to the jury all day yesterday. No questions, no notes to the jury all day today. Obviously, a very diligent jury. They have been deliberating, we'd say, about 23 hours, which really is not that long compared to some other political corruption trials. For example, George Ryan, former Governor George Ryan, was 10 days. Former Governor Rod Blagojevich was 14 days on his first trial, 10 on his second. So actually, not that old. But, you know, these jurors were up against kind of a false deadline called Christmas. The Judge Virginia Kendall did tell them if they could not come up with a verdict by tomorrow, that they would give them Christmas off and then come back the following week. Obviously not that the case. They have now come up with a verdict. What we do know is that Ed Burke and his wife Ann and their children are now in the courtroom. So is co-defendant Pete Andrews. He is a former 14th Ward aide to Ed Burke. He is also in the courtroom. We believe that they are still waiting for Charles Quay. He is the developer, Charles Quay, the third co-defendant in this case. We do know that his attorney said that at the beginning of the week that his office is about 15 minutes away. So he said, let's try to give him 15 minutes to get here to the courthouse. Now, Ed Burke and his wife Ann have been local. They've been hanging out across the street at the Union League Club, which is they are members there, which is kind of interesting because the Union League Club was a part of this case and part of the Burger King portion of this case, where Ed Burke is accused of trying to shake down the owner of a Burger King and actually talked about his law firm at the Union League Club. Again, this was a very long case with a prosecution that began almost 5 years ago.
Ed Burke was Chicago's longest-serving alderman and for decades the most powerful as chair of the city's finance committee. Sworn into office in 1969, Burke would go on to represent Chicago's 14th Ward for more than a half-century until earlier this year. His reign on the Southwest Side ending after he decided not to seek re-election. But the investigation into his alleged wrongdoing had already been underway for years at that point. In November of 2018, the FBI raided Burke's 14th Ward office, reportedly taking boxes and computers. They executed a second search warrant at his office in City Hall, where butcher paper lined the doors and windows while agents spent hours inside. Burke appeared unflappable.
I have always cooperated in investigations. I will fully cooperate in this one. And I'm confident that there'll be nothing found to be amiss.
In January of 2019, a federal complaint was unsealed, accusing Burke of attempted extortion by illegally trying to steer business to his law firm, which handles property tax assessments. He again was confident in his response and vowed to fight the charges.
I haven't done anything wrong, and I'm looking forward to my day in court.
Then that May came round 2 of federal charges. A sweeping 14-count indictment was handed up against Burke, charging him with racketeering, federal program bribery, attempted extortion, conspiracy to commit extortion, and using interstate commerce to facilitate an unlawful activity. Prosecutors linking him to multiple criminal schemes in which he allegedly used his massive influence and public position to solicit and extort work for his law firm. 2 of those schemes involved a Burger King in his ward and the development of the old post office. Burke was also accused of threatening to hold up a fee increase at the Field Museum because they ignored an internship application from a family friend. After several COVID-related delays, his corruption trial finally began in November, and much of the evidence used against Burke were his own words from wiretap calls to face-to-face meetings that were secretly recorded. Some of those conversations involved former 25th Ward Alderman Danny Solis, who turned on his old friend and ally in City Council by becoming a government mole. Burke pleaded not guilty to all charges. in a fall from grace that has transformed this once powerful politician to potential prisoner.
And we are just told that Judge Virginia Kendall has now entered the courtroom, which means that Charles Quay, that third co-defendant, is now in the courtroom. She said that once all parties are there, they're going to go ahead and read the verdict. Again, this was a very complicated case for the jury. 19 counts, 14 against Burke. So those 14 counts include racketeering, which according to legal experts really is a pretty difficult type of charge to sort out. If you are a juror, they have to have two acts that they have to prove. They're trying to prove under racketeering that there was a pattern there. So that was probably the biggest challenge for jurors. But again, 23 hours, they have now come up with a verdict. Mark, Judy, back to you guys.
Sarah, we just want to mention that Sarah Schulte is standing by for us in the lobby area. We do have a team right there in the courtroom. As soon as we get the verdict from the jury, we will bring that to you right away. But as we await that, Sarah, talk a little bit about the jury instructions. You mentioned that this is a very complex case. Even the jury verdict form that we have been able to preview is somewhat complicated. And there were hundreds of pages to the jury in terms of instructions.
That's right. There are over 350 pages of jury instructions that took Judge Virginia Kendall over 4 hours to read it to the jury. So that is a lot to go through. Matter of fact, when there were questions, I think they had actually two questions, one request on Monday, and one of the answers that the judge said was, they're in your instructions, go back and read them. With 350 pages of jury instructions, obviously, whatever questions they had, something was definitely in there. So that was a lot for them to decipher. Going through those instructions, trying to figure out with the evidence how it all applies to the law. Big, tall order for those 9 women and 3 men. From, by the way, the makeup of the jury, most of them are from suburban Chicago. Remember, this is the Northern District of Illinois, so it pulls from about probably over 20 counties all over northern Illinois. One of the jurors, I think, is as far as Montgomery. So, you know, these jurors, these were diligent jurors. The judge would talk about it, compliment them daily, how all of them were here early, taking notes, really paying attention to 6 weeks of the testimony.
Obviously, it is a lot to take in. More than 38 witnesses, 16 days of trial. And of course, we're going to check in, Sarah, with our Chuck Gowdy. Chuck, we just heard that the jury is now in the courtroom as well.
Mark, and Charles Quay is actually not in the courtroom. The late word from the courtroom is that he was feeling ill, and in fact, the judge has now waived his physical appearance with his agreement, and he is appearing by a video feed from wherever he is for the reading of these verdicts. 23 hours of deliberation may seem like a long time for some of us, but in the context of federal criminal racketeering trials like this, the rule of thumb is that a jury is likely to deliberate 1 day for every week of testimony. Well, that would be 6 days of deliberation, and we're nowhere near that. That generally is thought to be bad news for the defendant. A jury that manages to reach verdicts relatively quickly, 23 hours in this case, maybe half or less than half of the time that would be typical in a case like this. But we'll find out soon enough as this is unfolding in federal court right now at the Dirksen Building, 219 South Dearborn, where so many Chicago politicians have stood before judges, stood before the bench to hear mostly guilty verdicts announced after their long trials, and many of them have ended up in prison over the years. Nearly 3 dozen Chicago aldermen have gone to federal prison for similar kinds of cases brought against them, as Mr. Burke is now finding himself standing in the court of law to answer for these charges and to hear what this jury has determined.
And Chuck, you certainly have been covering this the city for a long time, and unfortunately some very major corruption cases here in the city and the state. Give us a little bit of context as we await the verdict right now. How major this is for the city of Chicago, for city council. Ed Burke has been a power broker in the city for a long time here.
Well, along with that, Judy and Mark, Ed Burke has also had a very large target on his back. Federal authorities have kind of danced around this big power broker of a figure in Chicago, Ed Burke, for many, many years. You probably could go back decades if you opened up the FBI files on Burke to determine that they have been looking at his behavior, his actions, his associates. And it really, the changing event in all this was that they got an undercover individual who Burke seemed to trust, who wore a wire, wore a hidden camera, and recorded many, many hours of Ed Burke doing business as usual, according to what prosecutors said, and that was acting corruptly.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about former Chicago Alderman Danny Solis. I believe the FBI has talked about him as being one of the most prolific cooperating witnesses they've seen in years. What was he able to provide in this case, Chuck?
Well, the main thing, Mark, he was able to provide is a body with access to Ed Burke in the confines of his private office. Nobody else was able to do that. The FBI over the years may have wanted to bug Burke's office or put hidden cameras inside there, but they apparently didn't do it. But a trusted individual like Danny Solis, who managed to have Burke's attention in the privacy of his office while he was wired, Burke apparently not realizing that was the case, that was the difference.
Okay, thank you very much, Chuck. Let's head back out to Sarah Schulte at the courthouse right now with some of the verdicts just coming in.
Okay, Mark, what we're hearing is that Charles Quay, who we just said is the third co-defendant who is not present in the courthouse. On count 12, the indictment finds Quay guilty. Count 13 of the indictment finds Quay guilty. As to count 13, unlawful activity on bribery, commercial bribery, count 14, guilty. As in count 14, unlawful bribery, activity of commercial bribery, count 15, guilty. And count 17, guilty. I do believe this all has to do with Charles Quay. Again, he is not in the courtroom. His involvement in this case only has to do with one of the four schemes. It has to do with the pole sign and the binnies. What we do know is, I know he's not in the courtroom because he's feeling ill. Two of his attorneys actually had COVID at the beginning of this week. They did come in here masked. So that is so far what we have with Charles Quay, who appears to... And now we got another one, Pete Andrews. He is the former aide to Ed Burke. He is found guilty on count 5, 6, 7, found not guilty on 5, 6, 7, 8, and 10. Completely not guilty. Again, he was an aide to Ed Burke in his former 14th Ward office. His involvement in this case all had to do with the Burger King scheme. And so that is what we have so far. Again, Charles Quay, the developer, the co-defendant, not guilty, and guilty, and Peter Andrews not guilty. Back to you guys. We're now just waiting for Ed Burke.
Okay, we are waiting.
Went through by co-defendants here first for
yes.
Andrew. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So okay, we just got in information on Ed Burke as well. Let's see here. We have Ed Burke guilty on one count. Racketeering acts agreed on. Post Office Act 1A, B, 1C, 1D. Let's head back out to Sarah Schulte for a look at those guilty verdicts for Ed Burke. Sarah.
Yeah, right, and you know, this is a big one. Racketeering is a big one. It is in terms of sentencing, it takes up the most amount of prison time. This is a big one, and this will probably have a lot to do with some of the other verdicts, whether it's bribery, extortion, that are coming through. But he is guilty on racketeering, and as I mentioned before, they have to find that he was guilty on 2 acts of this, and they did find him guilty on the post office, 2 acts of the post office, and an act in the Burger King as well. So this is a big one for Ed Burke right here, and he is found guilty of racketeering on count 1 of racketeering. We're waiting for the other counts. Again, 14 counts against Ed Burke.
So much more to learn here, obviously, but a huge verdict coming out there against Ed Burke.
So just to recap for you a little bit of what's happening here. So these verdicts are being read upstairs in the courtroom right now, where we have a team that's relaying all this information to Sarah Schulte, who's standing by right there. But as you heard right there, the big count here, the big charge for the feds in this case is that count 1, which is racketeering. And in order to find him guilty, jurors would have to agree unanimously on 2 separate racketeering acts that they were committed. Apparently they did in this case. You're looking at our graphics right now, our team producing this for you as we speak. So that is the big verdict this afternoon.
Yes, we are getting more information about what's going on inside the courtroom as well. Our Craig Wall is there talking about basically what Burke's demeanor is after looking at all of this, and we are going to take a look at that in just a moment. Burke, count 2 guilty. He has his chin on his folded hands, his gold watch glinting in the courtroom light. He's staring toward the front of the courtroom. Family has their heads hung behind him.
All right, we just got word on count 2. This, again, is against Ed Burke. Guilty, corruptly soliciting and demanding things of value. Count 3, also guilty, using the use of an internet facility. In this case, that's a legal term for email accounts and cell phones, an interstate facility to aid unlawful activity. Again, these verdicts just coming in 1 count at a time.
Okay,
what do we know about count 4?
He is guilty on count 4, use of an interstate facility to aid unlawful activity. Count 5, also guilty of attempted extortion. He is not guilty on count 6, extortion conspiracy related to the Burger King project. And count 7, he is guilty, use of an interstate facility to aid unlawful activity that is in relation to the Burger King project. We are okay. Count 8. He is
also guilty.
Also guilty.
And this is applying to both Burke and Peter Andrews, his co-defendant in this case, and it does relate to the alleged Burger King Racketeering Act scheme in this case. Count 9, guilty, use of an interstate facility to aid unlawful activity. This count applies to Burke and his use of his personal AOL email account in relations to the Burger King Act.
Okay, Burke is guilty on count 11, which is the corruptly accepting and agreeing to accept things of value related to the pole sign permit. That's in relation to also things that Charles Quay was charged with. And count 15, he is guilty, use of an interstate facility to aid unlawful activity. Again, this is I don't know, lawyer speak for using outside of government email addresses to conduct government business or to steer business. Count 16, he is guilty. Ed Burke, use of an interstate facility to aid unlawful activity. This is tied to mobile phone usage in relation to the pole sign permit as well. And count 18, guilty, attempted extortion. This is related to the Field Museum and blocking a fee raise. There's more on that, of course. And count 19, he is guilty, use of an interstate facility to aid unlawful activity. That's tied to mobile phone usage, also related to the to the charges levied against him about blocking a Field Museum fee increase.
Very interesting as we, our entire team here is trying to dissect and go through these counts. You're watching this as we were getting that verdict relayed to us from the courtroom. The verdict form is pretty long. We have an expert here sitting on the set. We will get to him in just a minute. But even what the jurors have to go through in terms of handing back and handing down this verdict is somewhat complex. So as you heard, as we're trying to go through their various counts, some are related directly only to Ed Burke, who is the former Chicago Alderman in this case, but there were also 2 co-defendants in this case along with him, so some of the counts were against them. So we're going to try to go through all of this for you.
Let's take a look at this and head actually back out to Sarah Schulte, who is at the courthouse right now with more.
Okay. That's right. As I could add this up correctly, Ed Burke was only found not guilty on one of those counts. He was originally charged with 4.
All right, for some reason we lost Sarah's picture. You saw Chuck Gowdy, who was standing by, of course, also bringing us some analysis on this. I think Sarah was in the process of saying that by her account, so correct us if we're wrong, in the booth here, that Ed Burke, in this case, only found not guilty on 1 count out of the 14 that he was facing. Is that correct?
I believe that is right, and that's what Sarah was saying in the field. So we'll check in with her in just a minute. But we do want to bring in, okay, we're back out to Sarah. Sarah, okay, is that correct? Burke was found not guilty on just a single count of the 14.
A single count out of the 14. Again, pretty stunning for a man that held such an incredible amount of power in this city for over 50 years. Again, this was a prosecution that began 5 years ago, and it all kind of began because of the former alderman turned government mole, Danny Solis. And the one thing the prosecutors made very clear in this case is that when they put that wire on Danny Solis, the purpose was not to go after Ed Burke. It was to go after somebody else. And during the process, they were hearing the conversations between Solis and Burke, specifically talking about the post office, where Ed Burke, on his own, asked Solis to maybe, hey, when you're talking to the developer of the old post office, tell them about Clafter and Burke, his private tax law firm. So really, the prosecutors say it was really Ed Burke, that it was his own words that opened up the investigation into him. There have been investigations in Ed Burke in the past, but nothing that has come to this close. And really, it was because of this government tool that they had, and this government tool was the recordings, thanks to Danny Solis. And one thing I also wanted to, one thing that too, just kind of added at the end of Joe Duffy is Ed Burke's attorney, at the very end of his closing argument, he said to the jury, Ed Burke, please send Ed Burke home. He is going to be 80 years old on December 29th. Of course, that was objected to and sustained by the judge, but clearly his age, his birthday coming up, the holidays coming up, obviously had absolutely no impact on the jury's decision here, as they have found Ed Burke guilty of 13 of those 14 counts. And Mark and Judy, back to you.
Yeah, we are waiting their reaction as well here this afternoon. Want to bring in our legal expert who's sitting here on the set joining us this afternoon, Chris Hottalling, former prosecutor. You sat down literally as we were going through the verdict. You heard what we reported, just 1 count not guilty, the rest of them guilty against Ed Burke. Your reaction right now?
Well, from the government's perspective, about as close to a clean sweep as you can possibly get. They've been spending a lot of time investigating this case, trying this case, and now having the opportunity to come back and hear the jury return guilty verdicts as to virtually every count, and probably most significantly, the top count, the racketeering count. That is the count that really subsumes all of the conduct that was at play in this case. And to get a guilty verdict on that particular count has to be particularly satisfying for the government.
And when you think about how difficult it is to actually get a guilty verdict on racketeering, because it is a complex issue for a jury to sift through to find that.
It's a complicated charge, but it's a powerful charge from the government, as we've heard during the course of this case, able to bring in a number of disparate acts, bring them all together, and present them to the jury to essentially say to them, this is the course of the corrupt conduct that Alderman Burke engaged in. You know, because of its power, it's also complex. And as you just talked about, the instructions are complex. It took the Judge Kendall a long time to get through them, but the jury was able to digest it, digest the evidence, marshal it, and come back with a guilty verdict.
Quickly, are you surprised at how quickly this verdict came in?
I thought it would be this week. Whether or not it was going to be today or tomorrow, but I think it's pretty reasonable given the amount of evidence and then the time of the holidays.
Okay. Well, let's head out to political analyst Laura Washington, who's also standing by. Laura, I mean, this is massive news against such a historic Chicago alderman. What kind of ripple effects and reaction do you think this is going to face in City Council?
Well, you're right, Mark. This Alderman Burke is probably the most powerful, certainly the longest serving alderman in the history of Chicago. He had a tremendous amount of power, and to be brought down in such a sweeping conviction, I think sends an unforgettable message to the rest of the Chicago City Council as it stands now. We've had many convictions coming out of the Chicago City Council, but never one by someone who is so powerful and who has so much influence. This is going to be something, the reverberations of this conviction are going to be heard for a long time to come. And I would say to the members of the city members of the Chicago City Council, you'd want to watch your backs, because he was convicted largely with the help of former Alderman Danny Solis, as you've discussed before, and the tapes and the other materials that he was able to gather for the federal government. That was a colleague of his. And so if you're out there and you're thinking about some wrongdoing, you want to watch your back with your other colleagues.
And Laura, on that note, take us back just a little bit. I mean, how seismic was it when we finally all learned that the government mole, so to speak, was Alderman Solis and making these recordings? How major was that announcement?
Well, you knew it was major because Solis and Burke were close colleagues. They were friends. They were allies. So if there was someone in his position who was able to get that close to Ed Burke, and Ed Burke had always been seen as untouchable because he was so powerful and because he was, pretty careful. So the fact that that had been going on for some time made you know that there was something really powerful going on here. The other moment that really struck with me was when the feds raided Ed Burke's office at City Hall. Again, he's the head of the Finance Committee, had been for many years. They go into his office, they put brown paper over the glass walls of his office, and they get their goods. And so that was another message that even the most powerful can be brought down.
Yeah, I mean, and that is the message going forward. And I think it is a cautionary tale, again, as you mentioned, to anyone trying to or thinking of doing wrongdoing as a sitting member of government. So, Laura, thank you very much. And let's also talk to our legal contributor, Tony Thedford, who is also standing by. Tony, what was your reaction to this this conviction in the courtroom and such almost a sweep in the charges against Ed Burke?
Well, thanks for having me. I am not surprised of the sweep. The racketeering charge was the main charge, and essentially the other charges essentially fall as kind of fruit of that tree. So I'm not surprised by the clean sweep. I am surprised about the speed of the verdict, though. I think someone mentioned earlier that it's typical to have 1 day of deliberation per week of trial. Since this was a 6-week trial, my estimate was that they would come back after the holiday, with the judge having already given scheduling as to how that would be handled if they had not reached a verdict by tomorrow. So I am surprised about the speed, but I do believe that the speed was probably necessitated or by the recordings. And when those jurors heard the words coming out of Alderman Burke's mouth, it must not have taken long to debate whether or not the meaning of those words and how they related, obviously, to the charges. So in hindsight, it makes sense that they would come back as quickly as they did, but it was my anticipation that it would take longer because typically these cases do take a while in deliberations. Racketeering charges are difficult to prove, but clearly the government did it here, and they largely relied, again, on these recordings in order to do so.
And Tony, I want to ask you a question. On the defense side, anything stand out to you? Anything surprise you, struck you in the defense strategy in this case?
I think the calling of Alderman Solis is I guess, would be the most controversial sort of approach to the defense. It certainly is not shocking, but at the same time, that was the difficult kind of the all or nothing sort of presentation by the defense. If they were able to make some headway with Alderman Solis, there was a great possibility that these racketeering charges would fall. So I see the necessity from the defense standpoint, but that was really the core piece of the evidence here. In addition, of course, to the recordings, it's always chilling when you actually hear the words of an accused when that person has not testified at their own trial, which is, of course, his right to exercise. And so anticipating that he would not testify at his trial, government had the advantage of playing his words and it almost acted as if, in some people's mind, as an admission of the allegations against him.
Obviously, I mean, this is exactly what you're saying. I mean, I think that is so powerful when you are able to hear him and he's not testifying in the trial itself. How important do you think it was for the recorded testimony, or the recorded evidence rather, that was on camera as well, to actually see him saying those words, not just on a tape either?
Well, in a criminal case, proof has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. So, the closer you get to actually seeing the man say the words, the closer you are to proving the case beyond a reasonable doubt. So there was audio. In many cases, we only have audio. Well, maybe we can create some doubt based on the audio. Who may have said it? Well, that issue's resolved when you have the physical manifestation of the declarant of the statement making those statements. So it really clears up the whodunit relative to the statement. And once you get past that piece, it's ascribing meaning to the words that came out of the mouths of those people that are recorded. And it's up to the jury, using their own abilities. They don't have to be lawyers to do this, using their own abilities to decide what those words meant. And they've obviously decided that those words meant that he was guilty of these charges, these 13 charges that he's found guilty of.
Yeah, and speaking of the recordings, a lot of recordings. We're talking about close to 100 recordings in this case that the jury had to go through. Tony, stand by with us. We will come back to you, of course. Right now, we want to go back out to the federal courthouse. Sarah Schulte standing by, who has been watching and covering this case from the very beginning. I know our political reporter, Craig Wall, is there as well. Sarah, anything new from your end?
Well, Judy, Burke's trial team, we are expecting to come down at any time right now. Before Burke left the courtroom, though, he was told by the judge to return to court on June 19th for a post-trial hearing. Now, my colleague, political reporter Craig Wall, was in the courtroom when the verdicts were being read. Craig, tell us a little bit about, Burke's demeanor and how his family reacted.
Yeah, I was watching him closely as he was sitting waiting for the verdict to come in. He was staring forward towards the judge with sort of a blank look on his face. You could tell he was very much deep in thought. When the verdict came down, no expression, no reaction, but his hands were kind of on his fist like this, sitting there sort of just listening and watching. After the jurors were all polled, his wife, Ann, came up behind him, put his arm around his back and leaned over. He kissed her on the cheek, and then she sat back down. His attorney would later come over and give him a hug, and they exchanged some words. Couldn't tell what they said, but no visible reaction from Burke, but he's been very stoic so much anyways. That doesn't really surprise me.
Well, it's interesting. He's been stoic, but he's also been paying very close attention to every piece of evidence that was entered into this trial. And even during closing arguments was probably the most animated I saw him. Specifically, I think it was maybe Pat Blagan, who represents Pete Andrews. Pete Andrews, who's the one that was found not guilty. Blagan's closing argument was very, had a lot of humor in it, pretty animated, and that is one time when we did see Burke laugh. So he was certainly paid a lot of attention. Something we also have to keep in mind here is that you just mentioned Ann Burke, who of course is the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Illinois, and really, has had her own storied career as well. She was here every single day with Burke.
Sitting right behind him in court.
Right behind him in court.
Yep.
Kind of involved too. If there was something, there was a question from the jury that came in the other day, she kind of leaned over with the attorneys kind of to take a look at it. Obviously, she's, very well versed in the law, so not a surprise. The other thing too is that he had his 4 children, and pretty much every day, one, if not more, of those children were there to
Both of his daughters were in court today, and we believe that the son-in-laws are there, and what it appeared to be one grandson who was also in there. When the verdicts came down, their heads were just hanging down. I saw some head shaking and disappointment and perhaps disbelief. Obviously, they're mounting their defense. They did not believe he was guilty, and the jury, except for that one count, sent a resounding message to political corruption in Chicago that this is not going to be tolerated. They saw through it. They didn't believe the defense, obviously, and this should be a message. Although we know from other cases like Blagojevich, when the judges have said, we hope this sends a message about political corruption. So it makes you wonder whether this is really going to send a message to anyone else or just Ed Burke.
Right. It's always the whole message thing, but I think the person right now who's probably shaking in his boots is Michael Madigan. And we know that trial is set to be, I guess it's set for the beginning of April.
Right, if it's not delayed.
But, there's a lot of similarities in terms of using his public position for private gain. So that is, and also Danny Solis is involved in that trial as well. There's plenty of recordings between Michael Madigan and Danny Solis.
And to your point, I mean, if this is the kind of case that they were able to bring against Ed Burke, who was, rather private man, we think Madigan may have been even more private and more careful with these things. But to your point, we've got somebody like Michael Madigan who's got to be looking at this saying, okay, wow, they must have, they've seen the discovery, but going into trial, this is going to put those attorneys for Michael Madigan on notice. The government's not coming against somebody like that without a significant, serious case. And you hear that from federal prosecutors when you talk to them on a regular basis. The federal government does not generally bring a case if they don't have a very good one. Now, they lost against Pete Andrews,
right.
So that's, an interesting aspect of this. But he was a much more minor player in all
Right, he was a minor player, and he was only involved in one of the schemes. And, Pete Andrews, it's kind of interesting. He was labeled throughout this trial. During the openings, they just kind of called him, they really tried to downplay his involvement with Burke. They called him...
Good strategy.
Right, they did, and they called him Lunch Pail Pete. They made it kind of a big deal about the fact that he casually dresses, which he did during the trial, probably on purpose.
Even wearing Christmas hats into the courtroom.
Right. I mean, he always came in with a sweater every day. But I think I think his attorneys successfely kind of sold him as kind of a minor player in this.
Distance him enough
from Burke.
Yep.
And his attorney, Pat Blagan, and from, and I'm editorializing here, but of all the closing arguments that I heard in that trial, he gave the best one and the strongest one. So obviously,
and the jury apparently agrees with your assessment.
Right. I mean, this is all about doubt, planting a seed of doubt, and clearly he must have planted a seed of doubt in there when they went ahead and went through those counts.
So I will say, before court started, I went up and asked Chris Gare and Joe Duffy, two of Ed Burke's attorneys, if they were going to be coming down and talking, and they said it was a decision they would have to make after consulting with their client. So we'll have to see whether Ed Burke wants them to say anything at all. We heard he was coming down, but it's quite possible they went down to another floor where they have been waiting and hanging out during the trial. I assume they have other things there to gather and pull together, so they're probably discussing what, if anything, they want to say, how they want to play it. It'd be a tough call to come out and say something after your client loses on all counts.
Yeah, it's very easy to say you might talk before, but then afterwards it's a different story. But it would be interesting to hear from them. We certainly would like to hear from them, but we don't know. And I'm not sure if the prosecutors are coming down or not. Have we anything?
I didn't get a chance to ask them anything. As we've seen, sometimes they just let the verdict speak for itself. They do not come down and talk, trying to just stay away from not wanting to create any issues further down the road.
Right. And sometimes they don't come down and talk because the Danny Solis factor is still involved with the Madigan trial, and that is upcoming. So,
and so to your point, it seems unlikely that we're going to hear from the prosecutors. But anyways, toss back to you guys in the studio for now.
Okay, you guys, thank you. Stand by with us too, though.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, we will be keeping an eye on anything that happens there in the courthouse. Thank you, Craig and Sarah. And we just got word, a reaction from former Mayor Lori Lightfoot about this guilty verdict. She says, quote, with this jury's verdict, Ed Burke should rightfully be remembered as a man who elevated personal ambition and greed over doing the people's work. Along the way, Burke has had many enablers, the pernicious practice of aldermanic prerogative, which, despite efforts to eliminate it, persists to this day, especially in zoning and development decisions. The other elected officials who over the years looked the other way as Burke systematically monetized the Finance Committee for his own personal benefit, and the party who gave Burke control over judicial nominations so that decades of jurists became beholden to him. Obviously, there's more as well, but Mayor Lightfoot, former Mayor Lightfoot, reacting strongly as well. Although Ed Burke was a big part of her election So that is interesting to see this kind of a reaction.
And I'm certain we will be getting so much more reaction throughout the afternoon. I wonder if we can bring in our legal analyst, Chris O'Talling, sitting here on the set with us. Just wondering if you can walk us through, because we mentioned, or Sarah Schulte mentioned, that Ed Burke will be back in court for a post-trial hearing June 19th. Quay will be back for a post-trial hearing June 17th. What happens during a post-trial hearing?
And so when we talk about a pre-trial or post-trial hearing in this situation, it's really a sentencing hearing. And so that's really what the judge has set upon the entry of the verdicts from the jury. Once the jury is discharged, one of the very last things that she did was to set the next court proceeding. And the next court proceeding is the sentencing, and there's a large number of steps that will happen between now and that date for sentencing, including the preparation of what's called a pre-sentence investigation report, a very thorough background check that's done into Alderman Burke, really a soup to nuts background into who he is, his background. Obviously, we know a lot about his background because of his role in public life here in Chicago, but it really goes from almost his childhood through his education, through his employment, up through all of the work that he has done on the city council. And so it's prepared by a probation officer, and the probation department is an entity of the court. They will do like I said, a very detailed, very thorough analysis, which will also cover not only the employment pieces, but also financial. All of the work associated with the law firm, any other employment that he has, including the work that he did with the city council.
Do you know what kind of sentencing we're looking at?
It's a great question. And it largely depends on what's referred to as the sentencing guidelines. Now, the sentencing guidelines are no longer mandatory. They're essentially discretionary, but the guidelines are what will frame how Judge Kendall will approach that sentencing hearing. I had an opportunity just to do a very, very quick look. And again, this is probably very conservative in terms of the numbers, but the guidelines as I see it could anywhere from be around 8 to 10 years.
Okay.
Now, it's very much up to the court's discretion. I expect that given Alderman Burke's age and the fact that he has no criminal history, that she will go significantly down from that guideline range. But that will also be a part of that pre-sentence investigation report that I just mentioned.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll check with you soon. Sure. Stay right here. Let's head on over to Chuck Gowdy, investigative reporter, joining us now with more. Chuck.
Well, this racketeering charge that Ed Burke was convicted of today, that really is the linchpin of not only this prosecution, but the fate that Burke now faces with up to 20 years in prison just on that particular count. That law was actually begun by Congress as a way to battle organized crime in this country, the mob, the traditional mafia. Of course, over the past 45 or 50 years, it has branched out to cover all sorts of things, from crooked politicians to drug dealers to different types of quote-unquote organized crime. In this case, Ed Burke is facing the reality of a lengthy prison sentence if it gets that far, because he was convicted of this racketeering, count 1. There you see it. Very difficult to prove. The feds, of course, have been criticized for bringing this in these kinds of cases over the years, although it now seems commonplace that if you are a politician accused of these kinds of things and you have been doing it with more than one person, that racketeering conspiracy is going to end up on the charge sheet that comes from a federal grand jury. But to say that this today was a slam dunk for the federal government, it was about as close as you can get without having LeBron James in the room. Just that one count against Burke he was acquitted on, but everything else the government set out to prove they apparently did. And we were talking a few minutes ago about planting the seed of reasonable doubt. This jury obviously had not only no reasonable doubt, but very little doubt at all in the case, at least, against Ed Burke.
One of the very first witnesses who testified in this case, a political science professor, she said, as mayors came and went, Alderman Burke was the one constant on the Chicago City Council. You mentioned that he was a top federal target for decades, spanning dozens of U.S. attorneys, FBI agents in charge, and City Hall administrations. Once again, tell us in some context, how big of a corruption case was this for the feds compared to some of the other corruption cases, unfortunately, we have covered here in the city?
Well, there's a lot of competition for big corruption cases in the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois, Judy. As we know, we've covered many of them over the decades. But just the passage of time that Ed Burke has been mentioned in the same breath with some type of wrongdoing or suspicion. It was the late 1970s that mayoral candidate Jane Byrne used the phrase, "an evil cabal of men now run the city of Chicago." Well, Ed Burke was on that fairly small group, the small cabal of what she considered to be evil men. She was elected because a lot of people remembered what she said about that. And you would have to think that today, wherever she is, Mayor Byrne is looking down on this and thinking they finally got Ed Burke, the man who I talked about in the late 1970s.
That's incredible. Okay, thank you, Chuck. And let's check in with Laura Washington, also standing by for some more reaction and thoughts on exactly what's happened here today. Obviously, the racketeering charge, the hardest one to prove, was proven and accepted by the jury, and Ed Burke stands now convicted.
Yes, and I think that this does not bode well, as I think Sarah Schulte mentioned earlier, for former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. There are many parallels between Burke and Madigan. The primary one is the power. Michael Madigan is probably the most powerful House Speaker in Illinois, if not in the nation, during his time. He was greatly feared. And he had been under the federal microscope. It had been the subject of many failed investigations for many years. The other issue is that Danny Solis was collecting material for the Madigan case as well as the Burke case. And so if the jury believed in the evidence that Danny Solis was able to collect, and much of it was recorded in either video or audio or on paper, if they believe the Burke evidence, that means that Mike Madigan has a lot to fear there. And it just, again, says something about the state of political corruption in Illinois. As Chuck mentioned, this is nothing new. We've had more than 36 aldermen have been convicted. Chicago aldermen have been convicted since the 70s of federal crimes. Illinois is seen as the most corrupt state in the nation and has been in terms of public officials for the last several years, according to a University of Illinois study. So this is nothing new, but this is going to be a message that may be heard more loudly than before, because you've got one very powerful man in the Chicago City Council who's just gone down, and another one's in the docket.
To your point, that Michael Madigan's trial is coming up in just about 4 months. So, you know, if it doesn't get delayed, we'll see that in April. So that is coming down the pike very shortly, Laura. And when you think about the message that this sends and whether you think this is going to make a difference in terms of ridding corruption, not just in Chicago, but in the state, do you think this actually is going to make a difference in that?
Well, you know, Mark, history does not bode well for that. The corruption's been endemic for decades. We've had several Illinois governors be convicted of federal crimes. We have 2 former aldermen, who are currently under indictment, and probably a few more probably under investigation. I would go back to hark back to what Lori Lightfoot said. As you recall, Lori Lightfoot campaigned in 2019, and won the mayor's race on Ed Burke by making the case that Ed Burke was, in the way he practiced his governing in City Hall, was corrupted, and that all that needed to be reformed. She wanted to eliminate aldermanic prerogative. Aldermanic prerogative has a lot to do with the power that aldermen have, the power that gives them leverage over regular citizens, over companies, over developers, the kind of leverage we saw Ed Burke use in this case. She campaigned against that. She didn't get very far, and there were some minor reforms of aldermanic privilege, but it has not been eliminated. It continues, and aldermen continue to hold that close. So to answer your question, I think the jury's still out on whether or not this is really going to make a major difference in corruption in City Hall and in Illinois.
But Laura, just one follow-up on that. Do you think it will shine a broader light, though, on City Council in general in terms of the conflict of interest when older people, some in very powerful and influential positions, are running their own business while running the city's business?
Absolutely will shine a light, but there have been several measures that have come before the City Council over the years to eliminate that connection. There's been a call by many government reformers to make aldermanic positions full-time. Those positions are paid very well by normal standards, and the expectations of those positions are that you, in many ways, you're a mini mayor of your own alderman, which requires you to spend a lot of time and dedicate yourself to those wards. And the argument has been that you should not have side businesses, not only because you should not have the time or resources to take care of them if you're really serving the public, but because they do present these conflicts of interest. It's been argued many times over the years, and I don't think that a sitting city council is going to, especially folks that have positions that benefit or can appear to benefit from their government roles, they're not going to vote to eliminate that.
And as you said, Laura, that aldermanic prerogative, aldermanic privilege is what the jury is looking at and saying that Ed Burke used to exploit and to shake down and was part of this racketeering scheme, the power that he held. So let's check in with Sarah Schulte back at the courthouse and with more news for us right now. Sarah.
You know what? Here comes the legal team right now. Ed Burke, his family, and his attorneys, as you can see, are walking out right now. Let's see if they come and talk to the media.
Chris, Joe, will you talk to us at all?
You can say to us in the cell.
His family is
That's right. Well, there you have it. Obviously, his attorneys, nor Ed Burke or his family, stopped to talk to the media. Ed Burke walked out with his wife and two of his daughters and some also extended family members. And both of his attorneys, Chris Gare and Joe Duffy, also walked out with him and did not come into what we're calling the media pen here to talk to us. As you all know, this was a very long trial, a very methodical trial, and we're gonna recap it. Do we want to roll the tape to recap it, or?
Live picture. Sarah, we're taking a live picture outside right now. I know you can't see this. Our camera outside is showing the former alderman now getting into the waiting vehicle again with his family. They decided not to talk to the media as they bypass that lobby area where all the cameras are situated.
It looks like he said a few words there right before getting into that waiting SUV that is going to take him off. As you said, Sarah, Ed Burke walked out with his wife Ann and extended family members as well. That SUV now turning the corner, waiting at the light as Ed Burke stands a convicted man this afternoon. Sarah, let's go back to you. In terms of the reaction from the family that you were able to see, and Craig, you might be able to weigh in on this as well, because you were right there in the courtroom. What was the reaction to the charges and to the verdict being read about those charges to his family?
Yeah, nothing overtly emotional, no sounds, no gasps, nothing that was audible in the courtroom. I just saw heads that were hung down by family members. I couldn't quite see where Ann was just from the people that were sitting in front of her, but daughter to Ann's left, son-in-law to her left, both had their heads down, just looking like, wow, what just hit us?
Right, exactly, and something big just hit them.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think this is obviously a lot for them to digest. I mean, you know, when Ed Burke walked into this courtroom every single day for 6 weeks, you know, he wasn't one of those defendants that ever hid from the cameras.
No, he didn't run.
He was kind of the old Ed Burke, you know? He walked right by and kind of walked by with confidence when he sat at that defense table. A lot of times he would lean back and, you know, kind of do this with his hands. I mean, he really, I sometimes even got the impression that he's here to beat this, you know? I mean, he thought he was going to really beat this.
Well, and I wonder if part of that that just simply goes to the fact that for years and years and years, Ed Burke just operated the way he wanted to operate. He ran the Finance Committee with an iron fist. He was the king of City Council for quite some time until Lori came along and, things started changing. But, he's used to being the one in charge. He lost that being in charge in here, and now his future, his fate, his freedom is lost and up to the hands of the judge, Virginia Kendall, to decide sentencing. What's interesting, and I don't know if the attorneys have weighed in on this, if so I missed it, but June 19 seems like an awfully long time to wait for the post-trial hearing.
Right, and there's still a little bit of confusion on whether that is an actual sentencing date or some type of post-trial. So
but either way,
see.
not going back to court for 6 months.
Right.
Now, interesting thing for Ed Burke, he's 79 years old, but on December 29th is his 80th birthday. He's going to be celebrating his 80th birthday in a way very differently than he'd hoped for or planned for.
We talked about his power, and there were mayors that didn't like him, right? I mean, there were mayors that didn't really get along with him. Mayor Daley, Rahm, Emanuel. But, he was untouchable with those two mayors. It really wasn't until Lori Lightfoot, and the reason why is because he was already facing an indictment at that point. I mean, her entire election, her entire candidacy and election was based on public corruption and because of the charges against Ed Burke. So obviously a little bit easier for her to go ahead and,
attack him
and confront him. As I was mentioning before, this is obviously a very long trial, lots of evidence involved. Let's recap the trial right now.
5 years after butcher paper lined Ed Burke's Finance Committee office signifying an FBI raid, the federal government's case against the former powerful alderman has come to an end. Close to 40 witnesses, 6 weeks of testimony, about 100 recordings, and 350 pages of jury instructions. A tall order for a jury of 9 women and 3 men. Their task was deciding if Burke is guilty of racketeering, bribery, and extortion. Burke is accused of using his official position for private gain, specifically steering business to his private law firm, Clafter & Burke. The government divided the case up with 4 separate schemes. Burke is accused of threatening to block a field museum fee increase after it dropped the ball on an internship application for Burke's goddaughter. Jurors heard a recording of a terse Burke showing his frustration to a field museum official.
Well, what I wanted to do was to...
I'm sure I know what you want to do, because if the chairman of the Committee on Finance calls the president of the park board, your proposal is going to go nowhere.
As proof to the extent of Burke's power, jurors heard testimony from the former Field Museum president, who explained how museum officials scrambled to make their mistake up to Burke. Another scheme involved a Burger King near 41st and South Pulaski in Burke's ward. Burke and his co-defendant, former aide Pete Andrews, shut a renovation project down because the restaurant did not have a driveway permit. Burke is accused of using the permit issue as he tried to convince the Burger King owner to use his private law firm for property tax appeal work. In a recorded phone conversation with the owner's son, Zoheb Dinani, Burke mentions the law firm and permits in the same sentence.
We were going to talk about the real estate tax representation, and you're going to have somebody get in touch with me so we can expedite your permits.
Former building department officials and employees testified that only the building department has the authority to shut down a renovation project, not an alderman, and the lack of a driveway permit is not a cause for it. Meanwhile, a pole sign in front of a Northwest Side Binny's Beverage Depot, far from Burke's ward, captured his attention after co-defendant and developer Charles Quay agreed to hire Burke's law firm, hoping the powerful alderman would help him. Because it was a sign out of use for several years, the city refused to allow Binny's to use it. Quay was worried he stood to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars on the development. But the centerpiece of the government's case involves the old post office renovation project. When former alderman turned government moles Danny Solis agreed to cooperate with the feds to save himself from bribery charges, prosecutors told the jury there was no expectation the investigation would involve Burke until he is heard on a recording with Solis pitching his law firm.
Well, while you're at it, recommend the good firm of Clafter & Burke.
Burke used Solis as the middleman between the old post office developer and Burke. The former alderman is accused of strong-arming the developer to use his private law firm for tax appeal work.
So far, we had no, the
cash register has not rung yet.
When the old post office developer dragged his feet on agreeing to use Clafter and Burke, Burke is heard saying this infamous line to Solis.
So did we land the tuna?
And when the tuna had yet to be landed and the old post office developer needed TIF money, which required Finance Committee approval, Burke says this to Solis.
As far as I'm concerned, they can go themselves.
During closing arguments, Burke's attorney consistently criticized prosecutors for not calling Solis as a witness. In her rebuttal argument, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Stryker argued what matters in this case are the words that come out of Burke's mouth, and she told jurors they are absolutely devastating to him.
And obviously guilty, 13 of 14 counts. Those, all his own words, were definitely devastating to Ed Burke.
And of course, prosecutors were counting on that very much so. And of course, you know, it was the defense who called Danny Solis to try to undermine him. Prosecutors did not call him, but they didn't need to because everything significant they had right there on those tapes.
Right, and you know, they made it pretty clear to the jury that, you know, it was the words that mattered from Ed Burke. It wasn't necessarily Solis's motivation, why he did it, or the fact that he cut a deal with the federal government. None of that mattered. It was as it really was kind of noise, really, and really what ended up mattering was some of those words that we just heard come right out of Ed Burke's mouth.
You know, I was making an observation a couple times that I've been in court listening to some of these tapes and clips we've heard before, and where you could hear Danny Solis talking to Ed Burke. My observation was it seemed he was very well coached by the feds on how to ask the questions in order to get Ed Burke to say what prosecutors needed him to say to make their case.
And that was part of the reason why the defense called Danny Solis. The defense wanted to somehow really try to, you know, prove to the jury that he was coached, that, you know, this was all about Danny Solis. But again, as you know, I've mentioned before, this whole thing started with the old post office, and it was Ed Burke that opened the door to this investigation to begin with. He's the one that offered up Clafter and Burke to Danny Solis. And so once that door was open, then the feds ran with it.
Yep, and the feds ran with it, and they ran it across the finish line.
Right, and they're continuing to run with it.
Yep.
Back to you guys.
Okay, absolutely. And Judy, you brought up a really good point, and I want to touch on what Sarah and Craig were talking about. Danny Solis was not called by the prosecution, and you brought up a good question.
And we're going to follow up on that. We have Chris, who's sitting with us here on the set, our legal expert here. Interesting strategy for the prosecution not to call Danny Solis, but you, I think, have a take on why you think that is.
It certainly was a gutsy call, and it potentially could have backfired. But as we all know now, it didn't backfire. The government's decision not to call Danny Solis is a strategic one, and principally because, at least from the way as I look at it, they're saving Danny Solis for the upcoming Madigan trial. There's a lot to be thought of in terms of trying to minimize the amount of potential material that a cooperating witness will have that could be used by the defense. So when you have someone like Danny Solis on the stand, he's going to be cross-examined extensively, and he's also going to be as part of his direct examination. If the government doesn't call him, there is not all that much paper. The amount of material that can be used for cross-examination down the line is minimized. So the government made the strategic call, and here, the right strategic call, not to call Danny Solis in their case in chief, not to have him, you know, presented with an extensive amount of direct examination and then a significant amount of cross-examination. They've saved him. They've saved the powder. The powder is dry, and when the next trial comes, I fully expect that Alderman Solis will be on that stand at the Mike Madigan trial.
And when you talk about, let's just dig in on that just a little bit more, because when you talk about that aspect of amount of paper, amount of cross-examination that the defense would get to do after, if the prosecution brought him up, you're saying that that's eliminating options for potentially Mike Madigan's defense team to bring up something that happened in this trial under oath that could be then used to sort of exculpate him.
Every single time that a cooperating witness is either interviewed by the...
I'm so sorry. We got to head over to the courthouse again. Prosecutors are just about to speak. Let's head over there right now.
Good afternoon. My name is Morris Pasquale. I'm the acting United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois here in Chicago. I'd like to start first by thanking the members of the jury in this case who answered their call to service and served conscientiously over the many weeks of this trial. This case was about bribery and extortion occurring at the highest levels of Chicago city government. Our office represents the people of the United States. The people have a right to honest and open government where decisions about official actions that public officials take or do not take are based not on their own private financial interest, but on the public interest. That did not happen in this case. In this case, Defendant Burke had his hand out for money. He tied the giving of official action by him to the giving of money to him in 3 separate corrupt episodes. And in the Field Museum episode, he attempted to extort money from the Field Museum for the benefit of a family member of a close friend of his. The public voted Mr. Burke into office, and they trusted that he would be guided by and motivated by pursuing the common good. He betrayed that trust. We are gratified that the jury saw this case for what it was and that they held Mr. Burke accountable for his corrupt conduct. Here with me, standing behind me, are the 4 prosecutors who tried the case: Sarah Stryker, Diane MacArthur, Timothy Chapman, and Shishma Raju, together with Amar Bachu, who's the head of our public corruption and organized crime section. In addition to thanking them, of course, my thanks go out to the FBI, the City of Chicago Inspector General's Office, and the Amtrak Inspector General for their hard work and dedication that led up to the successful resolution of this case. Our office remains resolute and determined to root out public corruption occurring at any and all levels of government and to bring those who commit public corruption offenses to justice. At this time, I'm going to turn the microphone over to FBI Special Agent in Charge Robert Wheeler, who has some remarks, and then I'm going to come back and I can entertain a few questions at that time.
Thank you. I would just say briefly, public corruption matters are extremely important to the FBI. They're a major priority for FBI Chicago. We will continue to work these matters as we've done for a long time, and we'll continue to do it. For this case, I'm just very grateful to the FBI Chicago agents, the analysts and staff that brought it and worked so well with the prosecutors here in the Northern District. It's a real testament to the quality of work that takes place here. Can't thank them enough, and also some of the partners that we had along the way. City of Chicago Office Inspector General, Inspector General for Amtrak, and just a magnificent partnership with the Northern District here. Thank you.
Okay, questions?
What's this say for the corruption that just continues to come out of City Hall and city government here, and historically, why this city has such a bad rap?
That's a $64,000 question. So Alderman Burke obviously joins a long list of corrupt city council aldermen who have been convicted of corruption charges over here in federal court. All I can say is what I said before, that we're determined to continue to investigate these cases using any and all lawful tools at our disposal to ferret out that corruption.
Do you think this is going to send a message that is going to change any behavior going forward?
Well, we have not had the sentencing yet, Obviously, Alderman Burke was a very powerful alderman. This case has had massive publicity. And I like to think that public officials out there who are tempted to start down this path will be either further on notice that, you know, the federal government is out there, the FBI is out there, the U.S. Attorney's Office is out there, and we're aggressively pursuing these type of matters.
Ed Burke was an alderman for 50 years before your office brought charges against him. What took it so long? Because this clearly established a pattern of behavior by Ed Burke, and I think it would be reasonable for someone to look at the evidence presented to the jury and say, this was not the first crime that the alderman committed. Why was he allowed to operate to amass the kind of power that he used to extort the victims in this case?
Well, in the United States, ma'am, the trials are conducted based on evidence.
Why did it take so long for that evidence?
Trials are conducted based on evidence. It is the responsibility of our office, together with federal law enforcement, to accumulate, assemble that evidence, present it to a point where we're satisfied it meets the standards of beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the process. The speculation about other things that went on and why it couldn't be done sooner, that's all a function of what evidence is available to us in a particular investigation.
Mr. Pascal, are you disappointed in the exoneration of Dean Andrews?
We respect the verdict of the jury in all its respects. Obviously, the jury was instructed to treat each defendant separately, to give separate consideration to each defendant, and they diligently discharged that responsibility and followed those instructions, and they reached the verdict. So I'm not going to say, I'm going to say I respect the verdict of the jury.
Do you have any sense of what kind of prison time Ed Burke could face on this? I know there's the general guidelines, but
I don't. You're aware of the statutory maximum time, but I don't have anything more precise that I can share.
For the maximum, sir?
Our sentencing decisions will be made, recommendations will be made after the completion of the pre-sentence investigation report, after we've had a chance to weigh all the aggravating and mitigating evidence, and then we'll formulate and submit our sentencing recommendations.
Just a couple more questions.
Is the investigation still going?
Our public corruption investigations are always still going. We're always not eagerly, have our ears open for members of the public who feel like their public officials have not lived up to their responsibility to conduct honest government. And so we're always open for business, and we're always all ears for those matters.
Is the jury's verdict a vindication of the prosecution's offer of Danny Solis's non-prosecution agreement? Do you think that what Danny Solis did helped convict Ed Burke, and does it merit him not spending a single day in jail for also serving as a corrupt alderperson?
Well, there were extensive jury arguments in this case, and I'll just boil it down to one proposition, that we feel like we presented the best evidence going to show Alderman Burke's knowledge and intent, the words out of his own mouth, and we don't regret that trial strategy one bit.
what should Mike Madigan read into this verdict?
So Madigan is a pending case, so I can't comment on that. Okay, fellas, I'm going to have to, ladies and gentlemen, I'll need to wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, there you have it. You have been hearing from the acting U.S. attorney here and also the FBI special agent in charge, talking about the 13 guilty verdicts, 13 counts this afternoon against former Chicago Alderman Ed Burke. Want to bring back in Krista Talling, who's sitting here on the set with us. You were in the middle of talking, but I also want you to comment on that. There was a question about how long this took for them to finally bring charges against the former alderman. The reality is, you know, several weeks, 5 to 6 weeks of trial, but they have been going after him they have been investigating for a long time.
Yes.
I don't think there's any doubt that Alderman Burke has been a target of the U.S. Attorney's Office for some time. I think that's pretty clear. I think the questions that were just posed certainly confirm that. It's when you have a situation where you have someone that's been in office for so long, as Sonny Pasquale, the acting U.S. attorney, just mentioned, you can only bring a case when you have the evidence before you that is sufficient to establish the elements of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you don't have that, you're not in a position to bring it. Obviously, over the last 3 or 4 years, with the efforts of Alderman Solis, they were able to do that. They were able to get Alderman Burke on tape. They were actually able to have video recordings, audio recordings, and that evidence and the view of the U.S. Attorney's Office was sufficient at that point in time to bring the charges that ultimately led to his conviction today.
Okay, let's head back out to the courthouse. Sarah Schulte is standing by, and we're checking with her after hearing from the acting U.S. Attorney and the special agent in charge from the FBI. Sarah, what can you tell us?
Well, one thing that they've certainly mentioned, that this is a case of bribery, extortion, and racketeering at the highest level in the city. And it certainly is the highest level in the city. I know we have talked a lot about, matter of fact, it was talked about in this trial about who has more power. Was it Ed Burke or was it a mayor? But certainly consistently for over 50 years, it was certainly Ed Burke that had probably the most amount of power. So there's no doubt when they said this is absolutely at the highest level. I also certainly was struck about the fact and the message coming from the U.S. Attorney's Office. They do this all the time when there is a public corruption trial, but the message out there is the prosecutors are here, the FBI agents are here, and they are continuing to investigate these type of cases. In terms of sentencing, he was asked about sentencing and are they going to ask for the maximum. He said at this point they have to wait for sentencing reports, and they will come up with some type of recommendation on sentencing at a later date. The other thing that kind of struck me also was the fact when he was asked about Danny Solis, and if the prosecutors at all regret the kind of deal they struck with Danny Solis. Danny Solis himself was facing a bribery charge, and he was struck a deal with the government where he's not going to have to serve 1 day in jail or prison. They said we absolutely do not regret the deal that we struck with them because this is the result of it. Back to you guys.
All right, Sarah Schulte, really appreciate your coverage. Again, she has been on this case from day one here for us there in the federal courthouse. Sarah, thank you. I want to bring in Laura Washington once again, our political analyst. Laura, you have covered Burke for a long time, Danny Solis for a long time here in City Hall. Your final thoughts before we wrap up here.
Well, I would just pick up on something that Sarah Schulte touched on, and that is the federal prosecutors saying that they are always investigating, they are always looking at corruption in City Hall and beyond. And that is the message that they want to get across loud and clear. And they also said, you know, if you know of anything as a citizen, as an elected official, as a public official, please bring it to us. That message may be one thing to make it across more clearly because of this conviction. Maybe it will give people who are aware of other wrongdoing, who've been caught in that kind of a web of wrongdoing with people like Ed Burke, maybe that'll give them some courage and incentive to come forward.
Laura Washington, thank you very much. And let's take a look at Tony Thetford here as well. And let's hear your final thoughts on this verdict that came down and in terms of what Ed Burke is now facing.
Well, I think the focus has to be obviously now on sentencing. I heard it suggested that the guideline range is 8 to 10 years, somewhere in that space. I agree that he's not likely to get that sort of a sentence, but certainly for a man who's nearly 80 years old, any length of time incarcerated is significant. We should also look into to figure out whether or not the attorneys for Alderman Burke are likely to file some sort of an appeal and attempt to keep him out of custody until the appellate issue is resolved. He has an absolute right to appeal this verdict. That will certainly happen, but whether or not he'll be in custody while the appeal is being fought is an open question at this point.
All right, Tony, thank you. Really appreciate your time here today as well. Once again, former Chicago Alderman Ed Burke found guilty on all but one count against him, including the most serious charge of racketeering.
Absolutely. We'll have much more coming up today at 4 o'clock, and we will see you then.
This has been an